I'm back with a new wardrobe and a new book to review. We're looking at the first story in the Blood Ravens Dawn of War Omnibus. The first story titled Dawn of War, written by C.S. Goto. Now, Kasern's Bastian Goto, or C.S. Goto for short, got to start writing several short stories, which was published in the Inferno magazine. And his first original novel, at least as far as my research goes, is the Dawn of War book. Now, the Dawn of War series, in particular the first story, is based off of the PC game Dawn of War, which was created by Relic. And the Blood Ravens, they're a Space Marine chapter that was created specifically for the Dawn of War series. And I will admit, I might be a little bit biased towards the Blood Ravens because they are my favorite Space Marine chapter, and that might be partially due to the fact that I used to work for THQ, which is the publisher of the game. And there is a tiny fact that I am a huge fan of the Dawn of War PC series. It's probably one of my favorite RTSs.
It's coming!
God, that's so awesome! But I'll do my best to not let that bias affect my opinion, although it probably will. So I guess the question is, does the story follow exactly with the game? And if so, does that hurt or actually help the book? Well, let's start talking about that. Now, the book does follow the game very closely. Now, when you're given a chance to do somewhat of an adaptation of a different work and into a different media, especially in this case, writing a book based off a game, it gives you a chance to really expand on the story. To go into areas of the game couldn't have because of its restrictions. And in that aspect, I think the book does very well on that. Now, if you played the game all the way through, you essentially read 3/4 of the first book in this omnibus already. But it's in that last quarter of the book where it really tries to expand the world in the game. Now, this story follows the exploits of Captain Gabriel Angelos. He is the captain of the Watch of the Blood Ravens chapter. Now, we find out that Gabriel Angelos, he had to perform an exterminatus on his home world of Cyrene. If you're not aware of what an exterminatus is essentially you nuke an entire planet. The entire planet is dead and gone. Life on that planet is eradicated. And he's done it because supposedly those force of chaos on the planet that was just taken over. And that was the only option he was given. But even so, causing the death of an entire planet weighs heavy on someone. And Gabriel is constantly questioning himself on whether or not it was the right choice. And he comes to the defense of a planet called Tartarus. And coming along to help him is his closest friend, Isidore. And Isidore is a librarian of the Blood Ravens chapter. Gabriel Angelos and Isidore, they have been close friends ever since they both joined the chapter. In fact, they joined the chapter at the same time. They were both part of the same recruiting group. And while on Tartarus, originally they're there to defend against the Orc invasion. The story expands to show that a legion of Chaos Space Marines are on the planet and they're trying to start up some trouble. And to make matters worse, the Eldar are there just to make things even more confusing. In fact, as the story goes on, the Inquisition get involved. While having their own secret agenda on being on this planet, they're also looking at Gabriel Angelos to see if he has any signs of corruption for what he's done, if his grief is affecting his actions. And all the while all eyes are on Gabriel, nobody notices that Isidore is slowly being corrupted by chaos. And that's the main story going on from the Blood Raven side. We also have a subplot based off of the Imperial Guard. While touched on very lightly in the game, we get to know a lot more about the main Imperial Guard characters. Now, the man leading the Imperial Guard regiments is Colonel Braun. In the game, you don't get to know much about him at all. In fact, he's actually just brushed aside and forgotten in the game. The book actually takes a chance to develop that character. And you can see that while he appreciates the help of the Blood Ravens, and to an extent the Inquisition, because while he is the commander of the entire Imperial Guard regiment, he essentially loses all command once the Blood Raven shows up. And you really get to see how that affects him and his men. And I thought the book did a very good job on trying to develop that character. Now let's move along to the plot with the Chaos Space Marines. Now these villains, they're fairly stock villains. They essentially want to summon their Chaos God. And in order to do so, they need to make millions and millions and millions of sacrifices. And this war is the perfect opportunity for that. There's also very minor petty politics going on with Chaos Space Marines. I kind of glance over it because essentially you've seen it a million times, where you have the one guy commanding and then the one guy who's working underneath him. Who's going to betray the guy who's commanding? Essentially, they're both using each other and they both plan on betraying each other. They're essentially there to drive the plot. Now, finally, we got the Eldar. Now, going from the game to the book, they're not really developed all that much. Now, while in the game, and this is a little bit of a spoiler for the game if you haven't played it, but come on, that game's like 6 years old. You should have at least played it by now. At some point, the Eldar summoned the Avatar Kane, and he's apparently an avatar to one of the Eldar gods, and he's really badass. Except in this book. See, there's a subplot on one of the Eldar main characters on how he advances and grows, and essentially becomes a sacrifice to summon the Avatar Kane. But the fight with the Avatar Kane is very disappointing. I remember him being fairly tough in the game. In this book, he's taken out within, I think, what was it, like 2 pages? And I'm not sure if this book is trying to punk him, or just trying to make Gabriel and Isidore look really awesome. But because of that, I'm just going to glance over that entire subplot. Because it essentially has a very disappointing climax. Another thing this book does a very good job at doing is explaining Gabriel's hammer. Now, if you remember in the game, Gabriel was handed a hammer called Godsplitter by the Inquisitor. And in the prologue of this first book, it explains the origins of Godsplitter. And I thought that was a very nice touch. It also helps explain why the Eldar are there, and why the Chaos Space Marines are there as well. Yes, they're trying to summon a god who's essentially trapped within this planet. And the prologue does a fairly decent job in trying to explain why this confrontation is happening to begin with. Now, while I have been praising this book on how it really expands the story in the game, that's not exactly saying that the story in the game was really good. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't a bad story. It did a very good job in advancing the game. But I wouldn't really put it as the top tier story. And it truly depends on what kind of books you have already read. Honestly, I'll put this as a fairly average book. If you're completely new to the Warhammer universe, this is a pretty good book to start off with. It does a good job of introducing the Blood Ravens chapter. It does expand the story in the game, so if you played the game, it wouldn't hurt to read this book if you wanted to learn more about the characters in the game. And it really helps introduce you to the world of the Warhammer universe. You know, it explains the Space Marines. You kind of get to understand how they work. Get an idea how the Imperial Guard works, the Chaos Space Marines, and to an extent the Eldar. Although it doesn't go into great detail on any of those races, it does introduce you to them. And it does give you a little bit of the basics on how they work. So as an introduction, I think it does a fair job. Now, if you're, let's just say, a veteran of the Warhammer universe, and if you've read a lot of the books and the stories and you're familiar with it, this story might not entice you. In fact, it probably won't. A lot of the characters, although I did say the book expands on them from the game, they're still fairly stock characters. While I did like Gabriel and Isidore, it was mainly the relationship the two of them shared, and how that relationship kind of affected their actions, especially as Isidore started drifting more and more into the dark side. And it does introduce other characters that you don't really see in the Dawn of War game. So if you're a fan of the Blood Ravens, if you're a fan of the Dawn of War game, and if you're looking for a good introduction into the Warhammer universe, it's not a bad book to do it. There's plenty worse out there. And while I do have the Omnibus, you could buy the book separately. But if you're on the fence on the book, you could also try the game. If you're an RTS fan, you can probably find it pretty cheap now. But anyway, that's my opinion. Take it for what it's worth.